You're sick if you think the fetus is a person. I'll be rolling my eyes until I see you in hell. These are just a couple of the nicer of the hundreds of comments and messages I received after making a pro-life comment on a pro-choice Instagram post. And it made me realize that where we're losing the fight against abortion might not be where we think. And that's the topic of today's episode. Welcome to the Mom Apologist. This is a safe place for your doubts. Here, apologetics meets discipleship. So join me as we learn to think biblically about how to walk this life as believers, struggling with tough questions, seeking hope, and finding answers together. Now, for the past couple months, one of the topics that I've been researching is the differences between the pro-life movement and the abolitionist movement. But this week, this event really triggered my thoughts and made me consider that there's an issue below the surface that both groups need to consider if we're going to make any progress on the issue of abortion. And I think both pro-life and abolitionist group really have the same end goals. We want to end abortion. But I don't think we can get there without addressing the very serious need in our culture first. The most recent Barna study showed a devastating statistic for the pro-life attitudes of Americans. Only 5% of Americans are in biblical alignment regarding family values and the value of life. 5%. And I saw evidence of this decline myself this week. When I saw this post on Instagram about a very young woman, a child, who had been SA'd by her stepfather and became pregnant as a result, the post was applauding her ability to have an abortion and kind of assuming the necessity of her having an abortion. I commented, and I knew it was taking a risk to do so, but I commented basically that the situation was tragic and heartbreaking, and that no one should ever have to make such a decision or experience that kind of assault. However, that maybe there were other ways to love and support her than abortion. I don't think the girl was evil or depraved. I didn't call her a murderer. But abortion ended the life of her child too. And an abortion added trauma to the trauma that she'd already experienced. And that perhaps there was another way to love her better. And I don't want to get sidetracked into the debate about whether or not an abortion is acceptable in this kind of situation or not, because I think we can have that conversation. But the issue that I was getting at is that there were two human beings who exist and were alive as we navigate that difficult decision for us to consider. Now, I expected some pushback. I even expected hostility. But nothing prepared me for the onslaught that I received. And I've been on social media for a long time. I'm familiar with keyboard warriors and how bold we can be, and I still was not prepared for the death threats, the wishing death on me, the wishing grape on my daughter. People who saw my comment and replied, there were hundreds. I couldn't even read them all. I did not see a single one that agreed with me at all, and I didn't see any that were having a reasonable conversation. But that was one level of disagreement. The next level was people coming onto my Instagram and commenting on whatever post they could find, regardless of content, and calling me evil, swearing at me, wishing that I would die, telling me they would see me in hell, bashing me as a person and as a Christian. And then the private messages began. Because you think a fetus matters in this situation is disgusting and horrifying. And that's just a simple summary of days worth of trying to have a productive conversation with a couple of people who seemed like maybe I could make a dent into their ideology, put a stone in their shoe. But at least outwardly, I saw no movement on their ideology. And it made me realize there's something far more sinister going on in our world that explains why abortion is such a sacred cow. We've lost respect for all human life, not just the preborn. People are willing to threaten to injure or actually injure born human beings to further their own opinions and agenda. We can see a total depravity in how we value human life as a culture. One example this week was a young man who stopped a girl to ask her for her phone number. And the young girl was wearing a backpack, so it looked like she was coming from school or going to school, high school, college age, maybe at the oldest. And she said no, and he started getting upset and getting a little belligerent. And she said no again and tried to turn and walk away from him, at which point he chased her down, picked her up, and slammed her to the ground and stomped on her head. I understand that he was hurt because she rejected him. Rejection hurts. But his response was potentially lethal and life-altering. He didn't value her life. He didn't see a value in her life except where it came to pleasing him. And that's where I see something has shifted in our culture. We have pushed a narrative or allowed it to be pushed in such a way that we should do whatever it takes to be happy, and that is how our life has meaning. And because of that, we've created a culture willing to trample on the rights of others to get what we want. And we've created a youth so miserable that nobody even knows what it means to be happy. And some of my research into social emotional learning actually shows the more you ask people whether or not they're happy, the more they think about whether or not they're happy, the less happy they become. Because you can always think of something that could be better or something that's wrong. Even if you're having an amazing day, there's something in your past that you regret or something that happened that was painful. We can always think of a reason to be unhappy. So the more we think about it, the less happy we become. And we see this in mental illness. Mental illness is skyrocketing. In fact, there was a Gen Z youth study done, and the results were published in September of 2025. This was a poll done of California teens and young adults by Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Youth Mental Health Initiative and Children Now. Now, this study is from California, so it focuses on that particular demographic. So we can't necessarily extrapolate all the data across the whole country because kids in Alabama or rural Arkansas might not feel the same way that kids in California do, but we can see a trend. It was 87% in previous years, and it's now up to 94%. So we can see this higher rate of mental illness is growing in our youth population. And the fact that this poll comes out of California actually fits with what I think is happening. We're seeing this rise in groups that tend away from orthodox faith or belief in God, which has a belief in a higher purpose and meaning for our lives, that it's outside of our personal happiness, that's outside of politics or a political agenda. And that makes sense then that we see a study out of California that has become increasingly secular over the last 50 years or so would show that the youth are starting to feel this shift away from meaning and purpose and feeling lost. Another similar survey was the US General Social Survey. It broke down mental health according to political party. And it was looking at groups under 40 specifically, so a little bit older demographic than the Blue Sky poll. This showed that people under 40, if they were strong Democrats, 56% identified as having mental health problems, while only 15% of strong Republicans. So we can see a trend happening among groups that tend toward belief in faith of some sort, often Christian. And there's a similar trend in beliefs about violence. September 2025 poll from YouGov about political violence showed that 26% of liberals think political violence is acceptable, while only 7% of conservatives said the same. I would argue that that should be zero on both ends of the spectrum. We should never use violence to change someone's mind on politics. To defend someone, to protect life, maybe, but not to serve a political agenda. Now, what we're seeing is a trend that groups that tend away from faith seem to have higher incidences of mental illness, report more mental illness, and report a greater affinity for political violence to achieve their goals. Now, I know that's not always true, and we're absolutely generalizing for the purposes of this conversation, but Republicans will often identify with an Orthodox faith tradition, usually Christianity, and Christianity emphasizes the value of every human being as being made in the image of God, and we are given meaning and purpose for our lives. While secular progressives view the world through the lens of oppressed versus oppressor, often calling the labeled oppressors Nazis or Hitler, which creates a permission structure for violence. Because who wouldn't take the opportunity to stop Hitler if they could, using violence? So it creates this idea that in order to stop this viewpoint you don't like, you have the right to be violent. Now, some will never cross the line into physical violence, but we're seeing more people being willing to do so, or at least be willing to take their protesting into a more physical resistance. They're emboldened in a way that can lead to violence. For example, just last night, and some of the news is still coming out, so we are still following this story. But what we know so far about the man who attempted to shoot Trump, Vance, and whoever he could kill in their cabinet, he said he wanted to do it in decreasing order of importance, except for Kash Patel. So Kash must be doing something right. But he had a mission where he saw the only way to get rid of these people that he considers evil was to do evil. And he doesn't see the hypocrisy in his statements at all. He doesn't see how he's devalued his own life. This highly educated man threw his whole life away for a chance to get rid of an administration that will be gone in less than 3 years. He didn't value his own life, and he didn't value the lives of other people who might get caught in the crossfire. He said he wasn't going to go out of his way to injure any law enforcement or hotel employees. But if they got hurt, he understood that was the cost. Absolutely saw no value in the lives of the 2,500 people who were going to be at that event and how his actions could result in their death. We can't win the fight against abortion with people who think political violence is okay, with people who rip down posters that offend them because they can't stand to look at them, with people that threaten the lives of speakers with whom they disagree, people who think that it was okay for Tyler Robinson to shoot Charlie Kirk, with people who think that it's okay to throw things at or on people who are speaking about issues that they don't agree with. They flip tables of people that are sharing views they don't believe in. Anyone who thinks assassination is an acceptable response to rhetoric, we can't win the fight against these kind of people about issues like abortion until we change what's driving them. Now, can I pause and ask you for a favor? If you're enjoying this podcast, please like, follow, subscribe. Go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a review. It helps get the truth in front of more people who need to be encouraged there are good reasons for what we believe and that we have evidence to support why we believe it. So how will we win the fight against abortion with people like this? We won't. We won't. Now, I don't think we should stop fighting. I do think we should stop fighting each other. If we're on the side of saving babies, I think we need to join forces, find common ground, and end abortion. But that's a topic for another podcast. I think we need to keep speaking the truth about abortion to anyone who will listen. But we're not going to win this fight because a lot of the truth that we are speaking won't land on the rocky soil of their hardened hearts. They're trying to fight against what they think of as evil, as they define it, but not as God defines it. And when we're unmoored or unconnected from God, from His goodness, from His righteousness, from His love, we're lost. And the longer we're lost, the harder it is to turn and hear His voice. Romans 1, verse 18 says that people suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. Living a sinful life suppresses God's truth in our hearts. Verses 21 through 23 basically says that when we suppress the truth in our unrighteousness, our thinking becomes futile. Our foolish hearts become darkened, and we exchange the worship of God for the worship of man-made things. Now, we don't bow down to golden calves or bronze serpents, but we do set things above God in our lives. And we all do that to some extent. Even as strong believers, we have to focus and deliberately choose to fight to keep our eyes on Jesus. But people that don't know the Lord at all, who've never accepted Jesus as their Savior, who've silenced His call on their lives, they can't see what makes perfect sense to us. That all human beings are of infinite worth because we're made in the image of God. So before we can convince people that abortion's wrong, we need to convince them that Jesus is right. Ezekiel 36, verses 26 and 27 says, "A new heart will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall heed my ordinances and do them." This passage talks about how God exchanges the heart of stone for a heart of flesh, a heart that is softened and in tune to His voice and wants to please Him and obey. This passage from Ezekiel is really meaningful to me personally because I fell away from following the Lord for a long time. And I became really desensitized to my own sin, much less the sin of anyone else. One of the issues I know I was desensitized to was abortion. But when I came back to God, my heart began to change and my stance on abortion changed. If you're interested in hearing that story, I have another podcast episode. I used to be pro-choice until this changed my mind. So you can go check that out and hear the whole story. But what I noticed was while the science of fetal development and DNA changed my mind, It was my love for the Lord and following closely with God that changed my heart. Knowing they were unique human individuals with their own DNA from the moment of conception didn't matter to me as much as born people whose happiness or pain I could see. And this is kind of that toxic empathy that Allie Beth Stuckey writes about, where our feelings about some situation override what's right and wrong, and we end up using this empathy to make bad decisions. My care for the unborn was overridden by my care for the person I could see until I understood how God sees all of us, regardless of size or development or environment. I didn't understand until God changed my heart why adults need to do the hard things to protect children and not ask children to do hard things for adults. This is a concept that Katie Faust is trying to teach people as she fights for the rights of children to be raised by their biological parents when at all possible. That adults should have to do the hard thing, not getting to be a parent, keeping a pregnancy, raising a child, because that child has the right to their biological parents, if at all possible. But it relates to the topic of abortion because pregnancy is hard. The pro-choice side wants to say that we don't care about the woman who's pregnant. And I think that's categorically false. We absolutely do care for her. We just don't think her life matters more than the life she's carrying. That both lives need to be considered. The powerful should do hard things to defend the powerless. And that's why we think that we prioritize the fetus, embryo, baby, above the comfort and convenience of the woman, and that we consider both parties when we make our decision regarding life. But I didn't get that until God changed my heart and made me more sensitive to the things that He loves and more sensitive to the things that He hates. In Proverbs, God says that it's an abomination, the hands that shed innocent blood. But until I cared about the heart of God, I didn't care about the things that God cares about. And it took a long time. It wasn't one conversation. It wasn't even a handful of conversations. It was years of people talking with me, of redirecting me, of drawing me, of me learning to walk with the Lord that changed my heart. And that made me realize that we all have human rights because we're human, because we're made in the image of God. And we can't win the war against abortion until we help people care. Now, in the aftermath of my day being attacked on Instagram, a fellow apologist, David Wolcott, sent me an interesting article called Fresh Blood for the Vampire. Now, this article was written many years ago, almost 20 years now, by Camille Paglia for Salon magazine. And I think it's interesting because she writes pretty boldly about abortion. She says, "Hence, I have always frankly admitted that abortion is murder, the extermination of the powerless by the powerful. Liberals, for the most part, have shrunk from facing the ethical consequences of their embrace of abortion, which results in the annihilation of concrete individuals and not just clumps of insensate tissue." She admitted it was murder. She admitted it was a person, that it was a concrete individual and not just a clump of cells. And that was almost 20 years ago. But today I hear, you're sick if you think a fetus is a person. How dare you care more for a clump of cells than a born person? So half the issue is the way they see the developing fetus. But the other half is the way they see people who disagree with them. Disagreement is treated like betrayal of the highest order and not worthy of discussion. It is worthy of, at the bare minimum, saying the most awful things possible, preferably with all caps and lots of swearing, a dash of death threats. Now, if that's the way they treat me, clearly a living, born, breathing human being who has a family, who has consciousness, who is sentient, I can even do algebra, and I'm totally independent. If they are willing to dehumanize and attack and threaten me, the only way we're going to win the fight against abortion is by making more disciples of Jesus and allowing him to change their hearts. So we've got to start sharing the gospel as much as we can. We shouldn't stop trying to end abortion. I know I won't. But I don't think our efforts are going to succeed until we humanize all humans again. One of the major factors that turned the cultural tide against chattel slavery in America was the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, because it humanized slaves. The reader was able to put themselves in the position of the slave and feel the injustice and feel the pain and recognize their humanity. Because of that, the emotional, psychological, and cultural tide began to turn against slavery in the average person. Now, I don't know how we do that with abortion, except by asking God to exchange their hearts of stone for flesh. And we do that by getting more equipped to share the reasons for the hope that's in us and the evidence that we have for our faith. You know, it's easy to get complacent and be content to sit in our Christian echo chamber, safely in the salvation lifeboat, while the world burns. I'm safe. Those I love are safe. We can't do that. We need to be actively drawing people to Christ. And that's how we're going to change the cultural opinion on abortion. That's how we're going to change hearts and make them care. Because we can show them the facts and we can show them the statistics. And there are times that those are powerful things. But until we show them why they should care, we're going to be losing the battle. And I don't think we can afford to lose this battle much longer. Please let me know how I can better equip you as a Christian to go share the truth of Jesus Christ with people so that we can save people eternally and save babies from abortion. Until next time, keep seeking truth. Hold fast to your faith. Never be afraid to ask the tough questions because God has answers.